Thank you very much, Minister Rattenbury. That was a really good start to our day. I should introduce myself. I'm Alison Russell-French and I'll be the MC for today. I was for 13 years on the Council of Birds Australia and 6 of those President of Birds Australia. I'm currently the chair of the Canberra Ornithological Group, and I'm also, for my sins, chair of the Australasian Wader Studies Group. So I have a fairly strong connection with birds, amongst other things. Andrea is originally from Switzerland and completed a Bachelor of Science at the University of Lausanne, undergraduate certificates of animal behaviour and neurobiology at the University of Zurich, and an MSc at the University of Geneva. Motivated in exploring new grounds in which her interest in animal behaviour and cognition could be combined with providing solutions to applied management problems, Andrea then moved to Australia to work on learning of predator avoidance behaviour in Tamar wallabies. She completed a PhD at Macquarie University in 2002. Awarded a Swiss National Foundation postdoctoral fellowship, Andrea moved to McGill University, Canada, to work on learning and cognition in Carib grackles and Zenaida doves in Barbados, a line of research she's continued since returning to the University of Newcastle as an Australian Research Council postdoctoral fellow in 2006. During her ARC, she established a well-resourced research facility to work on Indian mynas and built both national and international collaborations to work on this species.
So here's my talk. I'd like to start by showing you this map of the distribution of mynas, which includes its native distribution that's centred on India and expands to the east across Thailand, Cambodia and Vietnam, and to the west across Pakistan, Afghanistan. And of course all these areas to which the Indian myna has been introduced across the planet, including Australia and the North Island of New Zealand. So this leads to a fairly expansive range worldwide for the Indian myna, which of course is impressive, but what's amazed me even more than the expanse of this species across the planet is its behavioural flexibility, which is quite amazing. So you don't actually need to travel across the planet to realise just how flexible this species is. What you need to do is jump on the internet and you'll be able to download dozens of photos that illustrate how flexible it is. So we are based in Newcastle, second largest city in New South Wales, obviously. Very urban, but a lot of suburban areas as well, a lot of industry. And we've been studying birds in those areas, of course, but we've also moved out into more rural areas. So we've moved out into Maitland areas and studied rural birds. And then more recently, we're now starting up looking at birds here adjacent to more natural national park land and bushland. And Thomas is just starting to work in those areas, and Thomas is in the audience today if you'd like to chat with him. So we study mynas in captivity and in the wild. When we work with them in captivity, we trap them using a myna magnet trap with fairly good success. We have large flight aviaries at the University of Newcastle where we can hold them, and we can transfer them to individual test aviaries to run behavioural tests on them, either cages like this, flight aviaries like this, or small cages. This is a brief outline to my talk. I'll tell you first about what we know about how mynas learn socially about danger. Now, social learning, in other words, learning from watching others rather than through direct experience, is obviously very, very adaptive. It's a very effective means of spreading information through a population. Okay, so maybe only one bird needs to discover a new resource, a new food source, for example, and all the others can just copy and imitate. So it's very possible that social learning, which mynas are extremely good at, is one of the keys to myna success. I'll then talk to you about some work we've done on the role of opportunism and intelligence in the species and what we can infer about the role of these traits in the ecological success. So let's talk about social learning about predators. So when you want to know whether animals can learn socially, can learn from watching the responses of others, what to fear, you have to first of all know how they respond to predators in the first place. And you can do this. This is what we did very early on. We measured the anti-predator responses of mynas, and you can do this in a fairly straightforward way. You can show them with something like a raptor, and you can compare the responses they produce relative to other types of stimuli, for example, a novel stimulus that's a non-predator and a blank control platform. So how do they respond to these things? And here on the left, you can see a measure of visual attention. So these are head movements per second. It's a rate of head movement. Now birds don't, we move our eyes to explore an object visually. We can do eye saccades. Birds can't move their eyes in their eye socket, so they have to move their heads to visually explore an object. And you can see here, these are the head saccade rates evoked by the raptor and the pheasant, so that they clearly explore visually their objects much more than they explore an empty platform. So there is discrimination there. They can tell one from the other. And here what you can see is a very strong flight response that they are giving to the predator stimulus, but not to either of the controls. So they very clearly know what a predator is and respond to it. What they also do is they give that their alarm call, so that's specifically evoked by predators. They don't do that to any other type of stimulus. So now that we knew how they respond to predators, we can go on to ask whether they can learn socially about novel predators. So you can do this by simply presenting them together. This is a photo of one of a taxidermic mount that would have been used during these experiments, and we present these together with playbacks of a social alarm call. So we use a very high intensity social alarm call, which is called a distress vocalization, and sounds like this. So those of you who handle mynas might be familiar with that call. It's actually a call that is produced when they're captured by a predator, and it's often produced while we're handling them and removing them from traps. So it's called a distress vocalization. And we examine whether mynas change their behaviour towards this object after they've experienced it, coupled with these playbacks of these social signals. And here on the right, you have the data. Here are this measure of visual attention. So we're looking at how much attention they pay towards this object after it's been paired with distress calls relative to before. And you'll have birds that receive the two stimuli together, and you have birds that receive the two stimuli separately. And what we found was that mynas that have experienced the two stimuli together, the object and the alarm call, increase the amount of visual attention they're paying to this object relative to before. Whereas mynas that have experienced the two stimuli separately decrease their visual attention. They pay less attention to it afterwards. So this is a clear demonstration that coupling a novel object with an alarm signal produces learning in mynas. And you may think this is not a fully fledged anti-predator response at the end of the day, but we work with playbacks of alarm calls, which at the end of the day is a relatively low-key aversive experience. Presumably, all it does is it demonstrates that learning can occur. Presumably, if we had the ethics to ramp up the kind of aversive experience we were able to give them, then you would move to a fully fledged anti-predator response acquisition. We went from there to ask about social learning about dangerous places. And this was something that had interested me for quite a long while, because I've been doing a lot of bird trapping, particularly over in Canada and the Caribbean. And I'd often wondered, while I was removing birds from traps, whether all the birds sitting in the trees were learning to avoid this trap that I was setting up while I was emptying it. So it was something that I'd had in mind in testing a more controlled way for quite a while. The way we did this was we set up in captivity two cages. One is called a holding cage, the other one a foraging cage. And what we do is we release mynas from a nest box into the holding cage, and they're trained to cross through a connecting pipe to obtain food in the foraging cage. This is another view of this cage. You can simply see here the nest box. Again, the bird is released into the holding cage and walks through this pipe to get to forage in the foraging cage. And here's a screen that can be lowered and raised to control what the bird is seeing inside the foraging cage. Now, we conducted an experiment where we put an observer in the holding cage. So once it had learned to do this, it had learned to cross from the holding cage to the foraging cage quite willingly, which they do very well and very quickly indeed. We released an observer into the holding cage, and we allowed it to watch an alarmed demonstrator in the foraging cage. So this is a bird that's producing a very, very high alarm response Why is it so frightened? Because we're showing a cat mount right beside the cage. So it's showing a very high anti-predator response to that cat. I'll just show you here the observer in this cage cannot see the cat mount because there's a curtain here. All it can see is the foraging cage together with the alarm response of the demonstrator. And to cut a long story short, we found no evidence of learning. So the observer here, when it was released back into the cage on the subsequent day after having seen this alarm response plus the foraging cage, did not change its behaviour. In parallel to that, we were running another experiment where what we were showing observers this time was a human catching a myna inside this foraging cage. So this time the alarm response is not evoked by a cat sitting next to the cage, but a human actually capturing this bird and removing it. So this is what the observer watches. This time, we have a locomotion response here, which, as I showed you, is a big alarm response. It's a flight response in mynas. This is a legend that will go if you have values above 0 indicate that the birds locomote, the mynas locomote more in the foraging cage after this observational experience relative to before. If the bars go down, it means they locomote less after this observational experience relative to before. And what we did is we had experimental birds that watched a human capturing a bird inside the cage. And we had control observers that just watched a human waving a net inside an empty cage. Okay, so there was no myna. These birds here only watched a human waving a net. There was no alarmed demonstrator in the demonstration. And what you can see here is that birds that watched a myna being removed from the cage locomote significantly more when they're released back into that foraging cage after having watched a myna being removed. The birds that have simply watched a human wave a net locomote less, so they're becoming less wary inside this foraging cage after training relative to before. So these results demonstrate that social alarm signals trigger learning of associated objects in mynas. Okay, so any time we manage mynas or handle them and they're producing alarm signals, onlooking birds will be learning about those events, and they will be learning to associate things with what is happening. Interestingly, social alarm signals on their own don't trigger place learning. So social alarm signals, when we just showed them an alarm demonstrator in the foraging cage, the birds didn't care less about it. When they did learn, they also didn't learn if all they saw was the human next to the foraging cage. When they did learn was when they saw both, coupled the alarm response of the mynas and the cause of that bird's alarm, which was the human removing it with a net. So it seems that it needs that coupling. And that makes sense because at the end of the day, the mynas are learning. They don't just look at the alarm responses of the birds of conspecifics of other birds. They're looking for the causes. So they won't just associate an alarm response with a place. They will learn if they can see the cause of that alarm, which in this case is a human. So I'll leave that there and move on to the second program. We all know mynas are amongst the top 100 worldwide invasive species, the worst worldwide invasive species. They're one of just 3 bird species to be up there in the IUCN list. What they also have is a very large brain relative to their body size. And there is out there a hypothesis that says that when you have a large brain, what you have is enhanced cognition and intelligence. And Danny Sol in 2005 proposed that this intelligence actually facilitates invasion of novel environments. And there are various data sets that support that idea that invasive species have heightened intelligence. Also, the current thinking is that it facilitates invasion of urbanized environments. So people are interested in understanding how animals are adjusting to rampant urbanization. And it's suggested that cognition and intelligence will facilitate survival in these changing environments. So there's no doubt about it. These are data that mynas are extremely successful. We all know that. These are transect data that we conducted with Danny Sol a few years ago, and I don't want you to look at this whole list. I just want you to look here at the Indian mynas, and we have 3 types of habitats, bushland, suburbs, and urban. And you can see here, this is the number 100, about 190 Indian mynas were counted in the urban habitat. And this is actually 6 times more abundant than the most abundant native species, which is the noisy. The situation is somewhat reversed in suburbia. It's now the noisies that way outnumber the Indian mynas. We have about 5 times more noisy mynas in the suburban areas relative to Indian mynas. So Indian mynas are not only invasive throughout the planet, they're also doing extremely well in urbanised environments. So a key species to go and look at these ideas about intelligence facilitating adaptation to novel environments. So this got us interested in looking more closely at the role of intelligence and opportunism in the success of the myna and determining whether that is the way they survive in their environment. So we did some experiments in the field. These are data that show aggression around food. So these are experimental food sites. And you'll see here in blue, this is the number of time, they're called common mynas here, just in this paper. The common myna is attacked at experimental food sites. And in red, the number of time it actually attacks. So this is, in blue, received aggression, and this is produced aggression. And you can see here that common mynas around experimental food patches are recipients of aggression far more frequently than they attack other species. You can see the aggressive species are, for example, the magpies and the noisies. This is time spent at the centre of the food patch. So this is it's a measure of dominance and the ability to monopolise a food patch. And this is, again, the common myna. You can see the common myna is never at the centre of a food patch. So no evidence that they can actually monopolise this. Who is at the centre of the food patch? You can see the ravens, the large species, the magpies. The large species are dominating these food patches. These are all introduced species, and we looked at the extent to which common mynas, Indian mynas, are relying upon natural foods versus anthropogenic foods, and you can see here that they are typically foraging in the areas that we watch them on artificial foods, so scraps, leftovers, things that are generated by humans. They're not foraging on the natural foods. And when you give them food, so this is response to provisioning, so you throw out food, you're sitting on a bench and you throw out food to them, the common mynas respond most often to it. So these were all data that pointed towards the idea that opportunism is key to the niche that Indian mynas are occupying in these areas. They're actually not competing to occupy that niche, they're opportunistically occupying that niche. And I think overall, there is an awareness, a public awareness out there that we can capitalise on when we're thinking about management. There's no doubt that people consider mynas to be a public nuisance. And then there's the debate about whether, yes or no, they pose a threat to biodiversity. And Kate is going to, I'm sure, present some data to contribute to that conversation. But overall, people seem to agree that there's some degree of need to control mynas. And in my mind, I think what we need to think about is implementing control in a strategic way. So we have a finite number of resources, and we need to think about where are the best places and how is the best place to put those resources. And I think defining exactly why we're controlling will go part of the way to defining strategy. So if we're controlling mynas because they are a public nuisance and because Australians don't like having mynas everywhere in the same way that pigeons are becoming so abundant in Europe, for example, or in America, here we have mynas. People don't like that. Well, if we're controlling them because they're a public nuisance, then we need to be controlling them where they are the most visible, which is, around the McDonald's, around the supermarket places, where they are so visible to the public eye. If we're controlling them because they are a threat to biodiversity, then we need to control them on the edges of natural bushland, where they're likely to pose the most threat, and there's not much point in controlling them in supermarket areas. I think another obvious point towards increasing strategy is to gain a better understanding of the biology of this species. So at the end of the day, we know very little about mynas and their species biology and their population dynamics. For example, if we need to know what are the areas that are contributing most to increases in the myna abundance. So if it's the urban populations that are really successful and producing lots of offspring and increasing abundance, then we should be controlling in those urban areas. If it's, in contrast, the suburban areas that are producing many birds and contributing to abundance, then we should be controlling them in suburbia. And similarly, if what we aim to achieve is to halt their expansion across Australia, then we need to know where the dispersers have come from. So along the lines of what I was saying, where we think the dispersers might be these birds with certain personalities, we need to know which areas are breeding those birds with these personalities, these dispersing personalities, so that we can target those areas and be much more likely to capture those dispersers and remove them and halt the expansion of the species. I think there is also a need to think about and develop alternative means of control, and contraception is a possibility. I think this because, as Marie has been saying, it's very, very important that we have another tool in our management kit alongside trapping, because trapping is most likely to produce populations that would be resistant to trapping. At some point, there will be birds that we won't be able to trap. And to have another tool in our toolkit will allow us to capture those birds, and so we don't move towards a situation where we can't control them. I think also a technique that hopefully would be perhaps less labour intensive and less confronting, because as you've seen, although there's a lot of interest in controlling mynas and we can capitalise on that, at the end of the day, there's a small population, a small part of the population who are actually willing to kill mynas. And if we can develop a technique that's less confronting, then we'll be able to capitalise on that. And finally, I think it's extremely important to implement that control without cultivating hatred and cruelty towards the species. Because as a scientist who interacts quite a lot with the community, I have to say that I am very often quite appalled by the cruelty that's happening towards the species. And there's absolutely no reason for mynas to be the target of more cruelty than any other living creature at the end of the day. Thanks very much. I'd like to leave it there and just acknowledge all my students.